Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of my summer series where I sit down with spiritual practitioners of a mostly queer orientation. And today I have somebody who I've been looking forward to speaking to. I have Brandon Weston. Hello, Brandon.
Hello.
Welcome, welcome. So, unfortunately, we are coming close to the end of my summer series, but Brandon's book I should say, fits perfectly with the fall series of folkloric and traditional witchcraft and folklore. So, if you don't know who Brandon is, and I'll be honest with you, Brandon, I didn't know who you were until this year. So,
That's okay. That's okay. I just hang
all
out in
good.
my mountains and yeah.
For those who don't know who Brandon is, and I highly recommend getting in touch, looking into their work. Brandon Weston, Fayetteville, Arkansas, is a healer, writer, and folklorist who owns and operates Ozark Healing Traditions, an online collective of articles, lectures, and workshops focusing on the Ozark Mountain region. As a practicing folk healer, their work with clients includes everything from spiritual cleanses to house blessings. They come from a long line of Ozark hill folk and is also a folk herbalist, Yorb doctor, and we'll talk more about that soon, and power doctor. Their books include Ozark Folk Magic, Ozark Mountain Spell Book, and the forthcoming Granny Thornapple's Book of Charms, which I spoke about yesterday in my book review of these two. So if you're interested in reading more or listening more specifically about these books, go to my YouTube channel and look up my book reviews. And if you want to visit more and find out more about Brandon, go to ozarkhealing.com. So Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I guess, Brandon, maybe the first question we can ask, and this is a 101 question, I apologize, but the Ozarks, I think a lot of people, especially in the UK, a lot of my listeners in the UK will know about Appalachia, but they won't necessarily know about the physical location of the Ozarks. Can you just briefly tell us where is the Ozarks and how do you fit into that space?
Sure. There's a running joke about the Ozarks that we're not quite southern, we're not quite Midwestern, and geographically we kind of hang between these two areas. So the Ozark region, it's a mountain region. It's not actually mountains, it's an eroded plateau. So it's takes up a lot of sort of southwestern Missouri, northwestern Arkansas, then over into northeastern Oklahoma, southeastern Kansas. So it's a like almost a little island. You have the Great Plains to the west, you have, flattens out to the Midwest and the north, you flattens out to the Delta and to swampland in Arkansas and over eastern Missouri. So it's kind of a weird little region. And I always tell people, if you know Appalachia, great. So Appalachian people came to the Ozarks and made the Ozarks. So it's we are still a part of the Greater Appalachian Cultural Region. So Ozark folk culture is very, very, very similar. We are sibling cultures. And so a lot of what you find in Appalachia, you find in the Ozarks. It's just things kind of evolved in a different way here. And it has since incorporated in some different practices than you see in Appalachia. But essentially, it's very similar to Appalachian folk culture. Prior to the sort of Appalachian folk coming to the Ozarks, the Osage were the indigenous people who were here since the mid 1500s, and so the Ozarks opened up because of the Indian Removal Act and the
Right.
Trail of Tears and all of that. So the Osage were unfortunately removed. And so Ozark folk culture, we never really got to interact with the Osage in a lot of ways. So while we were in Appalachia, there was a lot of interaction between sort of proto Ozark culture and indigenous people of the Southeast. So there was some overlap, but the Osage have contributed a lot to the region, but unfortunately, we didn't get to interact very much.
That's the trouble with so many areas of North America, where, especially with the Trail of Tears, that legacy of removal, that legacy of blood in the landscape, right? And then cultures not having a chance to organically connect. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I apologize for the listeners. My dad is downstairs pounding a load of meat, so if you can hear that, I apologize. At home, right? um, so Brandon, I mean, over the past 3 years, your books came out in 2019, right? Or was it 2020?
2020 for the
2020,
first book, I believe.
right?
Or it might have been 2021.
I know it's all a blur, isn't it?
It is,
Right.
yeah. I think the first book came out like January 2021. Second book came out summer 2022.
So really, you've over the span of 5 years, this has been a huge part of your life.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's been sort of the culmination of a lot of research and a lot of personal practice and a lot of talking to people and collecting things. And yeah, it's really the culmination of all of that.
How does it feel? How does it feel to have put these out and now working on your third book? What does that feel like?
It's kind of strange. I knew going into it, because I know Ozark people, that
Mm.
Ozarkers would have a lot of thoughts and opinions about the books. And really, I mean, coming from this culture, a big part of the culture is sort of friendly debate. Ozarkers really love debating, but at the end of the argument or whatever, you'll have a cup of iced tea and be friends. And so that for me, it wasn't surprising early on when the first book came out. I got lots of Ozarkers contacting me, and Ozarkers, this culture is such a storytelling culture. It's really based in this sort of oral folk tales and things like that. And so everybody had a story. And so I feel like the book was really a culmination of a lot of work I had been doing, but the book also opened up the doorway for so much more work. And so I always tell people that, like, this stuff didn't end, when I wrote the book. It's still evolving. There are things that have come out even within my own family that I would have
Mm.
loved to put in the first book, but didn't know. And really, the book was kind of a really good conversation starter, not only for my own family, but for a lot of Ozarkers. And that was really the intention I had writing the book. I really wanted to revitalize the folk culture, specifically the healing and magical practitioner sort of folk culture, which historically has sort of been ignored. We do a lot of really good work preserving music and traditional crafts and things like that, and then the healing knowledge, especially if it's not based in plants. The plants are very popular, and that knowledge needs to be preserved as well. But historically, the healing practices, the rituals, the magical practices, the religious practices, even spiritual practices, have been ignored. And so the intention with the first book was to revitalize this stuff and to get people talking, because as I always tell people, if you don't talk about it, if you don't collect this stuff,
Right.
it's not going to be around. It's going to go
No,
away.
it's going to die really, really quickly. And that's across the board. All folk cultures are dealing with that now. And you go through a lot of the reasons for that in the Ozarks in your book. You talk a great deal about the change in lifestyle, the change in politics, the way that people are communicating now through the internet, the intergenerational pieces. And I really, really appreciated that outlook. I think there can be an issue with folklore in general, regardless of if it's like kind of geared towards the magical community, if it's geared towards the folklore community, of not seeing folklore as being in the present. It's always, the ancient witch in the woods and blah, 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 right? Or like how they did it 100 years ago in Victorian times, right? It's ridiculous, right? And so I really appreciate that piece. Um, we're going to get into that later on, especially with your newest book coming out, because there's a lot more of that in there about bringing that magic into the present. But for right now, I'm always curious. Your background is very much based in the academia. You did your master's, was it folklore studies you did with your master's?
I actually did French. So yeah, but because of my interest in folklore and things like that, I had very, very kind advisors who let me do more of what I was interested in. So I did some historical work with early French settlers in along the Mississippi River Valley, and then I did Cajun Creole studies and translated some some folk remedy collections from
Oh,
Cajun
beautiful.
Creole French
Mm.
into modern French into English. So yeah, that was my background, but still very folklore oriented.
Absolutely. Still, I mean, using all of the same tech, like all the same skills and techniques, that makes a lot of sense. I'm okay. So then I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question without sounding really challenging. Um, Coming from that academic background, and I know we had briefly spoken about this before, about how a lot of the individuals who were looking at your manuscript when you were first kind of putting it together and put it out there had said it's too academic, it's too academic, it's too academic. What was that process like for you? In translating then from the academia jargon and that perspective, can you give my reader, our listeners, a little insight into that process for you?
Sure. Yeah, it was very difficult for me to sort of change the way that I approached
Mm.
this, because so I started off not really writing. I started off collecting. In about 2012, 2013, I really wanted to go and do the work that, folklorists like Vance Randolph had done in the 20s and 30s. I wanted to go and sort of update the story, because that sort of collecting field work is very rare to find in the Ozarks.
Mm.
Actually, the Missouri Ozarks, there's a lot of the universities of Missouri put a lot of money into that sort of folklore stuff. Arkansas, not so much. So being from Arkansas, I really wanted to go out and do my own collecting, and I was coming from a very not really so I'm not an academically trained folklorist, so I was coming from a sort of amateur folklore, and I understood that going into it, that my methods were not always what scientific sort of folklorists would do. But really I just wanted to collect stories. And when I was a kid, we had this family reunion, and I brought a tape recorder, and for some reason I was like, I'm going to interview everyone and have them tell me stories. And so I've been doing this for a very long time, and so I went into it wanting to collect stuff for sort of my own personal exploration of where these practices are, where these beliefs are today, if they're still around. That was one of the main questions I had, is, the stuff that Vance Randolph collected, is it even around anymore? And so I really wanted that, but then I also wanted it to be a collection. I wanted it to be, to help preserve this stuff, to help carry this stuff on. And so it really was that sort of academic perspective. And then halfway pretty much through all of this, I started meeting people who would become teachers. And that's really what changed things for me, was people, because this is a very traditional way that Ozarkers have worked, and you don't see it very much, is, you have somebody who has the gift, who was born with the gift or passed the gift, and because of that, they are able to identify the gift in somebody else. And you don't really see that happening much anymore, because, people don't really care about that, the process. And so by sort of putting myself in this position where I was interviewing practitioners and healers, I was opening myself up to those practitioners and healers saying, hey, there's some reason behind why you have an interest in this. There's a reason. And I would come to find out that I have healers in my family, And in Ozark folk belief, these things go down the generations. Ancestor work is a big thing in the Ozarks.
Totally. Oh, totally.
Dreaming of ancestors and being passed power and all of this. So that was really the shift, and it came with one of my favorite teachers, who I worked with for years, and she sat me down and she really pointed at the gift at me, and she said, you've got this too. And now you have to decide what you want to do with all of this stuff that you've been collecting. And so, yeah, it kind of changed my view of all of this. I started, not really recording things as much, which this is kind of one of these areas. And I honor and I value the work that academic folklorists do. And part of what I see my role as is helping to encourage interest in the Ozarks, because I quickly recognized that I am not the type of person that can both collect to practice as well as collect to preserve.
Okay. Okay. That
It's
makes
just,
sense.
I couldn't keep them together. And so if I was collecting to preserve, I would forget what I was collecting. And I felt like what people were passing me, because again, this oral folk culture, passing things word of mouth is very important. So what people were passing to me, I quickly sort of understood was power. They were passing me the gift. They were passing me little bits of this power. And so I put the recorder down, I put the pen and paper down, and I just started experiencing it the way that Ozarkers have experienced this, not even in the Ozarks for thousands of years, all the way back to Northern Europe,
Yeah.
And so that's kind of when I sort of crossed the line from academic to practitioner. And so the first manuscript for Ozark Folk Magic was an academic text, and at the very wise advice from some practitioner friends, I scrapped that manuscript and I wrote something that was from my perspective as a practitioner, and also not only just my perspective, but a work that I hope honors the stories of all of the practitioners I've worked with, because that's the thing about all of this, is that we have a lot about practitioners from the perspective of non-practitioners. We have
exactly.
Storytellers telling the stories of practitioners, and when you talk to the practitioners, what they are actually doing is completely different.
It's true.
So everything that I do is, I always tell people this is my practice and the way I've interpreted the things that have been gifted to me, the things that have been passed to me. And I hope that by me, talking about this stuff and teaching about this stuff, I'm able to, in my own way, sort of open up and deliver the stories that have been given to me, and be able to talk about the lives that, have really influenced this work. And so, all of this early on, when Ozark Folk Magic came out, somebody asked, how would you describe this in like a very short phrase? And I said, this is my love letter to the Ozarks. And that's really what it is, me being able to, in my own little way, be a voice for the people that haven't been able to share their stories.
That's absolutely huge. I find I'm really resonating with that for my own work. When I sat down to write mine, I went through that struggle of, okay, whoa, what is this? What am I writing? Right? Because, in academia, we can write all sorts of bloody essays that have nothing to do with what we're actually interested in, right? But we have to do it because that's what we have to do in that system, right? I'm curious about something you said. You said that there was a turning point where you were given that feedback, right, from other practitioners, and particularly people that you really respected, and you were sat down and you were told you have this too, and it's almost sounding like, and tell me if this is turning into a therapy session, I hope it isn't, but it's almost sounding like there's that needing permission, right, to sit in that. So what was holding you back, do you think, when you started to write this and it turned like it was more of a like academic thing? Because I think a lot of people deal with that particular issue, what I suspect is happening. What was that? What was holding you back?
I think, so Ozark folk culture over the past 50, 60 years, and I mean, it really even stems back to like Vance Randolph's time, like to the 20s and 30s, where there was this big folk revival in the Ozarks,
Mm,
pretty early on. And it was a result of the work and this interest, but the folklorists were not malicious in their intent, I don't think, but it really created a museum exhibit.
right.
And so it was this, come look at the Ozark hillbillies on their front
Um,
porch. Look how simple they are. We think they can even talk to the birds and
mm.
animals, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so this kind of then pulled into all of the, post World War sort of religious conservatism that, popped up in Arkansas and the Ozarks, which, before the turn of the 20th century really hadn't been present.
Mm.
Um, that then merged with this sort of museum exhibit. Then it merged with the Back to the Land movement,
Oh, yes.
which brought all of these people from, LA and Chicago and New York and all these different places. They were again looking at that museum exhibit and saying, this is the promised land.
Of course.
We can go make a commune and we can finally be at peace in the
Yes.
Ozarks,
Apple and
forgetting that
avocado finding peace.
yeah, right. Forgetting that there was a culture here already. And so all of this has sort of culminated together. It has been mishmashed together. I mean, growing up, I remember being in elementary school into middle school, intentionally working in my room to get my accent to go away, to
Right.
stop sounding Ozark. And
Mm.
so, and I mean, this is something you hear about all the time. And my grandparents, they moved out from rural areas, and I collected a lot from my father's father, but not from my father's mother, because she lived a horrible life in the Ozarks and wanted to forget it. So these are
Yes.
all like little pieces that sort of influenced not only me, but I think influenced my generation of Ozarkers. This idea of distancing yourself from this culture. We can be better. We can be fresh. We can be new. I mean, before I was interested in this stuff, I really was interested in traditional witchcraft from Europe.
Mm.
That was a big interest area because I wanted to get away from the Ozarks. And
Right.
so I think all of that sort of kept me from digging deep into my own culture. And honestly, growing up, I didn't really know that there was a culture here. I didn't, it was just something you live. And yeah, my family did some weird stuff. And I had a great uncle who bought warts off of people and made them disappear. And, but you don't really think about it. And then, you know, I will say I have a lot of beef with Vance Randolph, but I will say, discovering Ozark magic and folklore, that was the first time I had heard somebody talk about Ozark folk culture, and not only just talk about music and food and stuff like that, but talk about magic and witchcraft
It's right.
and healing and all of this other stuff. And so I think really that was kind of the changing point for me. I felt like I now have the permission to sort of investigate my own culture, but I was still sort of on that outside looking at the museum display. And what really broke me out of that was finding practitioners, living practitioners,
Living
and
practitioners, right.
being able to engage with living practitioners in a more modern way,
Mm.
realizing that there's this foundation of traditional work that has sort of been kept going, but the processes, the rituals, the actual work above it is constantly changing, constantly evolving. And so that's really one of the things that excited me and still excites me about all of this, is that we are discovering new practices every day. Within our own practice in the Ozarks, we are creating new things. We are encountering new problems. We're addressing the community in a different way, and so it's a living tradition. And I think
Yes.
that was one of the sort of epiphanies I had. One of the realizations I had working with practitioners was that this is alive, but it looks different, and that's okay.
Love it.
Because
I
like,
love
I mean,
it. It's true. Hmm.
you know this in like the folk magic community, there's a very fine line between being a folk practitioner and being sort of anachronistic. And I admit I've crossed the line. I've put on the
Same.
overalls and the corncob
Mhm.
pipe, several times. But I think that was one of the major points for me, was this idea that this is a living tradition. And that's one thing I always want to get across to people, is like, this is constantly evolving. And so one of my teachers, we worked with battery powered tea light candles from the dollar store, or
Yeah.
we would go to Walmart and get little off-brand bottles of spices for stuff, or use what was already in the house. And I think, yeah, so I think just reaching a point where I was able to sort of let go of the sort of preconceived academic notions, but also just cultural notions that had been sort of passed to me, and just take things in a fresh way, really opened up everything. And I now I feel like I am an expert in this area, which that still sticks in my throat because I still don't really feel like I'm there, but I'm working on the sort of openness and confidence to be able to say, no, I do have things to say.
This is, I mean, that's a journey of being an author too, right? But you are a trailblazer. I mean, let's be honest here. Like I said in my review, like the Ozarks had never really been a place that I had knew anything about. I knew a little bit about Appalachia, but being up in Canada here and being of a British background, it's not something that I would necessarily know. Um, there's something that you raise, and I want to address it because I feel it so deeply. Is that anachronistic point of view within the witchcraft community, and I'd say even within neo-paganism in general. There's a very good reason why neo-paganism and the whole Celtic fair scene are constantly connected, right? And it's, I mean, it's weird for me, having grown up in North America but being from the UK myself, having that lived culture. That piece around that lived culture is so important, because then you can see bullshit when it's in front of you, right? Like I will not go to a Celtic festival because it's all fantasy land, right? I don't want to hear what your ancient ancestors who were Clan Montgomery or whatever, and how they had like a beef with this clan over here, and how it has to be like that, because majority of people in Scotland right now don't care about the clans, right? It's one of those things, right? I have noticed, though, and this leads into my next question for you. I have noticed, though, that there's a big issue with, and I think the pendulum is swinging in the folkloric craft community, but in neo-paganism in general, there's a big issue of religious trauma, particularly. And so, looking at like so-called rustic, quaint country cultures as being again based in the past, in the same way that Native American people are, of course, in the past, right? And not being seen as a lived culture. For you, I mean, your target audience when you were writing this was Ozarkers, but you also knew that you were writing for people outside, and you make great pains in this to talk about that lived cultural aspect. What worried you most that people would take out of this book? What worried you about the kind of the legacy of these?
Yeah, I think that this is this is a question that we kind of have to consider as the greater sort of folk magic or traditional witchcraft
Yes.
community, is that at some point, so my major worry with the book was,
Mhm.
first, that the community would say, you're making this up because it
Mm.
doesn't align with what the folklorists collected,
Right.
almost 100 years ago.
Right.
And that and actually nobody has launched that accusation at me yet.
Yeah.
But then the other worry was that Ozarkers would feel like I was misrepresenting them. And that has happened.
Yeah.
But there's a reason every class that I do, I always introduce with this phrase, and it's really become like a mantra for me. So there are as many practices in the Ozarks as there are practitioners. And so that is so important for me, because you have to remember, even the history of Ozarkers came to the Ozarks from Appalachia as families. They didn't come as towns. It wasn't like an entire city was uprooted and then plopped in a different place. They came as families, or like little clans, interconnected families. And so the traditions in the Ozarks have always been family based, and families differ from other families. And so you might have one family on one mountain doing things in a similar way as this other family, but they're going to evolve their own practices. They're going to change things. They're going to use what they have, pull different Bible verses out as verbal charms, things like that. And they might interact with each other, because that's another thing in the Ozarks. Ozarkers are magpies when it comes to folk practices. So like, if the person on the other mountain has a cure for a fever that I don't have, I'm going to get that. Like, they're going to teach me that, and then I'm going to teach them maybe this remedy I have for colic, or for stomach pains or whatever. And so that has always been the basis of these practices, is families doing things very differently and then mixing and mingling things. To now you have, there aren't even any unbroken sort of family lineages anymore. So you just have people collecting what they've heard, collecting things from, astrology books from the pharmacy, collecting,
Yes.
I met a lady who had a copy of the 6th and 7th book of Moses that she bought in 1956 from a pharmacist. And she was an Ozarker, and she incorporated that into her practice. And so the major fear I had was of misrepresenting the Ozarks. But in my own practice and my own work, I came to sort of understand that misrepresenting the Ozarks is keeping the Ozarks in that uniform, everything was this way in the Ozarks, everything. And unfortunately, the major proponent of that image are Ozarkers.
I
I
see.
mean, you go out to some of these rural areas and you talk to old timers, and they will tell you they'll paint with a giant brush over the Ozarks. And I mean, that's okay too. I mean, those stories can be represented as well. But I think the disservice to the Ozarks is really by not representing the variety and the diversity that has been in the Ozarks by way of practices.
Yeah.
And I think one of the areas that, I've fortunately been able to sort of work in, because I have amazing friends in the conjure and hoodoo world, is where Ozark practice and conjure mix and mingle. And so historically in the Ozarks, there at one time were upwards of 15 to 20, I think, thriving Black communities that were then unfortunately burned to the ground. And there was mingling of practices, which is why in Ozark traditional practice, as it was collected by the folklorists, you find very specific hoodoo and conjure practices that are represented. And if you were to just look at the folklorist and read those, you might say, that doesn't really seem Ozark. Oh, well. And then the story dies. But if you recognize that the Ozarks wasn't just this one thing, wasn't just this sort of homogenous, Protestant white European thing, if you're able to sort of look at the history and to talk to people, you can kind of understand the reality of the situation. And I think that that's one of the major focal points of my work, is the reality of the situation. not just the anachronistic, Ren Fair sort of image, which, as you were talking about the Ren Fair, so in the Ozarks, we famously have the Las Vegas of the Ozarks, Branson, Missouri, which I don't know if you're familiar with Branson,
I'm trying
Missouri.
to think. Is that where those that's where the big Civil War reenactment is, isn't it? I know.
There's a lot
Is that
in
where
the Ozarks.
Townsend's is? I think John Townsend's is around there, isn't he?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay,
So
okay.
Branson, Missouri, famously the saying goes that, if you're a washed up musician, you go to Las Vegas, and if you're a washed up Las Vegas musician, you go to Branson, Missouri. And so but Branson, Missouri has this theme park called Silver Dollar City, which I always tell people is the Disney version of the Ozarks. So like if you want to go find a lot of people wearing, overalls and having corncob pipes who are also from Michigan, you go to Silver Dollar City. And so
that's funny.
That's the image that I'm trying to get us away from. Specifically, as one person, I'm not trying to tackle the folk music world. I'm not trying to tackle food. There are people that can do that. I'm trying to, set the record straight for healing work and folk magic specifically, because
I think that's
of
needed.
the underrepresented areas in the Ozarks, that is the most underrepresented part.
Well, and let's be honest here. I mean, real spilling of the tea here. The magical community go through trends. I mean, Hecate is back on the spindle. I'm waiting for, for Santissima Muerte to come around again and have her turn again. Ceridwen is somewhere out there too. We go through these, like the majority of people who are coming into folkloric craft have had a hand in hoodoo, have had a hand in conjure, because that was a big thing 10 years ago. Before that, it was all goddess spirituality. Before that, it was all, I think Ho'oponopono was a big thing at one point, right? We go through trends. And unfortunately, it's like the staying power of people who come as tourists into a tradition. The ATRs have had this happen all the time, right? You may continue to get people, like you may have staying power, you may have people actually come and land and then they're integrated and they become, but then you have a lot of people who then will go on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing.
Right.
And so that piece around like the exoticism is, at least I've seen, is huge. The UK, it has that all the time, right? A lot of people who go to the UK and half expect it to still be like Camelot and King Arthur time, and exactly. And then they it's a deeply troubled, deeply issued country, and you wouldn't necessarily think that if you were like living in that paracosm of this exotic, beautiful place. Same with the Ozarks, right? Oh, I'm going to go down because of television and media. Do you think that on one level that appeal to authenticity, that appeal to like a realistic view will be accepted? Maybe that's too much of a big question, but
no, I think it will, because like you said, I mean, people go through different trends, and I think that the people that are really interested for the authenticity of the experience or the connection to the experience, they're going to stick around. And it's not going to be a trend. So I always tell people in my classes, like, if you're interested in this, give yourself space and time to grow with it, and if you're still interested in a year, then yeah, maybe something's there, and maybe you should explore it a little bit deeper. Ozarkers are always looking out for omens and tokens and things like that. I mean, all of the teachers I had, and most of the old timers I met, they will always tell like, if something's meant to happen, you'll dream about it. You'll dream an answer about it, or you'll see some like omen in the world about it. And so that's what I tell my students is, sit with it, move slowly. I mean, that is one stereotype about the Ozarks that is true, is this idea of slow moving. There is a deep spiritual reason behind that. But move slowly with it, because the people that are just trying to take something from it, or just trying to do some exploration, they're not going to move slowly. They're going to move very fast through it and try to get their hands on everything possible. I think that's another reason why Ozark folk magic is so hard to sort of commercialize and to, you know, grab onto, because the basis of Ozark folk magic is using what you've got, you know. And it's really hard to commercialize on that, because Ozarkers aren't going to buy your special, you know, bath blend or whatever. They're gonna learn how to make it and then make it at home from stuff they've already got. So I think there is a real staying power in Ozark folk practice, and I think it has a lot to teach people if they're willing to sort of take it slow and to work with it. I also, you know, folk magic, I always tell people, this is the magic of the folk. And so divorcing folk magic from the community, it doesn't make any sense to me. Because if you are a folk practitioner, you are going to practice where the folk are. You are going to practice as a part of the community. And if the community is changing and you aren't changing, then you're not a good practitioner.
Right.
And so that was another sort of thing that broke me out of those sort of preconceived notions about Ozark folk culture, was working with practitioners who were trying to develop their practice to address, you know, gender dysphoria and to address. I met a practitioner who was, you know, working against meth addiction that was rampant in her small rural town. Or, you know, one of my favorite healers that I worked with, what the only thing she did was people brought her prescription medication and she prayed over it. And so being able to be a practitioner working with modern medicine, but keeping the folk practices alive. And so if you aren't engaging in that sort of community dynamics and evolution of the community, then you aren't a folk practitioner. You're a tourist at that point.
Agree. I totally agree. And I would say that can be applied to every other folk culture that is now kind of within that sphere. I'm certainly seeing that even within some of the British, even within some of the Canadian traditions that people are connecting with, right? I think that point about, again, living in the now, living and bringing that practice into the now. So often, I think that people come to these traditions because of, again, religious trauma, because they're in a place of hurt, whatever the psychological reason is. But there's a tendency of escapism, and what I've noticed is that the people who, and I don't want to say the serious people, because I think it's part of the journey. I really do think that it's all part of the journey, and people will eventually find themselves where they need to be, where they want to be, and feel at home in that, and really deep roots into that. But I think that tourism piece is a problem. I think that I have noticed, though, and it's funny, I was chatting to somebody else about this. We were chatting about how it seems that, at least in traditional witchcraft, folkloric witchcraft, it seems to be marginalized people who seem to be coming to these traditions. BIPOC people, queer people specifically. I mean, looking at the guest list of my full podcast, majority of them are all queer. Same with my summer series, right? You know, it's interesting that we're finding empowerment as modern marginalized people in tradition, which normally we may have looked at as being the source of our oppression, right? Can you speak a little bit about that as a non-binary person, TM? What was it like for you as first of all coming to that identity, and how did that reflect? What was your relationship like with your tradition beforehand? A lot of convoluted pieces. Sorry.
No, that's great.
Just tell me. Tell me.
Right. No, it's a very interesting dynamic, because I'm not going to idealize the Ozarks. I mean, there are still places where, like, I always say, you know, I butch up a little bit, you know, and right. Because that's a part of this whole communication process, is knowing who you're talking to and knowing the environment that you're in.
Absolutely.
It goes back to the cunning, you know, being cunning and being able to know what's going on. So yeah, there are certainly places that are not queer friendly around, but one of my teachers, who we never really talked about the community or anything like that, but she, I would say, was probably queer just based upon a lot of our conversations. She never married. She was an older lady. She had for years a female roommate that she was very close to. So I don't know her life, but we bonded over certain things. And so she told me, and this is something that I've always kind of kept with me. She said, we were talking about magic one day, and she was kind of a product of both the Ozarks, but then also of Wicca that came in during the Back to the Land movement, from people from like LA and New York who had British witchcraft sort of as a part of their practice. So she was kind of a product of that. And she was one of the few rural people that actually use the term magic. But she said, magic has always been a little queer. And that has always stuck with me. And it's true. There's an inherent sort of queerness about magic, especially, the way that I have sort of engaged with magic is, this sort of connecting to the non-binary well springs of magical power that are inherent in everything in nature and in the universe, and the sort of non-binary identity of the Christian God that pops up in folk practice a lot in very surprising places sometimes. But so I think from an Ozark perspective, a modern Ozark perspective, I think that for me, my magic helps me sort of express my queer identity, and my queer identity helps me connect deeper to my magic, especially this idea of neutrality, which really permeates a lot of the basis for Ozark folk magic. This, neither good nor bad, working as nature works, working as nature works in the sort of, you're neither this nor that. You're sort of, to use or to borrow from the hoodoo community, the two-headedness of it, working in both worlds, being able to cross through that. And I don't know, this is probably a bigger thing to explore, and I'd like to explore it at some point. But this, a lot of the folk practitioners and healers that I have worked with in the Ozarks have had some queerness about them.
Makes sense.
And there was a medium that I worked with who was a Christian medium. He worked strictly with the Bible and all this other stuff. But his sort of take on the neutrality of what he was doing. In one conversation we were talking about, because he channeled a lot of both male and female identifying spirits. And I asked him, how he felt about channeling female spirits. And he said, the spirit doesn't have a gender. And so he was just channeling a spirit, and outside we were interpreting it as being, a male or female spirit. And this was from a guy who, if you were just talking to him in a cafe or something, you would be like, this guy is like one of those, rural Ozark conservatives that I don't want anything to do with. But there's always layers, of course. To quote, Shrek, the onions with the layers. So people always have these layers, and I think that in a lot of places, unfortunately, we're not ready to fully talk about that. But I hope that through my work, that maybe we can start the conversation a little bit more regarding the sort of queerness of magic, the queerness of being a gifted healer, or whatever that means. And I will say, where I am now is a historically sort of more liberal area. And I think here we're sort of embracing queer identity and magic and things like that in a way that I think a lot of places in more rural Ozarks aren't yet able to, which is kind of a shame. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think magic for me has always had an inherent sort of queerness about it.
generates about 1,000 other questions, Brandon,
Of
but we
course.
don't have time for those, unfortunately. But then let's envelop that into the next question about your forthcoming project. Then, what I love, first of all, what I love about that piece is that you give a very, very specific example of how your ability to work with tradition, not to create it in a new way, but to tease out those traditional roots in a different way that may not have necessarily come. Specifically, the example of working with the trans client in a way of renaming themselves, right, and rebirthing themselves. And I highly recommend for people to go and read that in this last section. I believe that's down in the conclusion section. So that leads us to the next question then. So how does that kind of working with the current that you've received as a practitioner and now as a writer, how does that envelop into your new work? Because you've written with a very different style and you're inviting people into the home. It's not just from an outside view of this is what the Ozarks look like and these are what the traditions are. You're actually dragging people in to sit down and have a sweet tea with your Granny Thornapple. What was that like for you to translate that into the story and bring people in?
Yeah, so the sort of origin of Granny Thornapple's Book of Charms started because I wanted to connect to the Ozark tradition of the teaching story. And that's how I learned a lot of what I practice today, was not in a theoretical way or anything like that, but by somebody telling me a story. And then, as one of my teachers said, if you are smart enough, if you're cunning enough, which isn't necessarily connected to intelligence or anything like that, if you've got the gift, the ability, you'll catch it. You'll catch what the meaning is. And so this idea of, you may be listening, and this happened a lot, listening to, somebody ramble on and on, weaving folklore into their story and things that aren't true and all these other stuff. And by the end of it, you feel like you've been on this sort of adventure, this visualization adventure with this person. But what happened with me was, there were things that I caught from the story. There were things, reading between the lines and saying, oh, this person's explaining practice. This person's explaining how to connect to spirit or spirits by way of these stories. There's something in there. And so that was really the origin for this, was I really wanted to connect to that idea. So a lot of my writing basis is in creative writing. And so I have always been sort of writing down, reinterpreting Ozark folk stories, things like that. And so I really wanted to write these folk stories, these teaching stories, and I wanted to connect them together so that there was this journey experience for the reader through this process. And I wanted to feature, as a sort of homage to my teachers, I wanted to feature a protagonist who was the amalgam of my teachers,
Right.
and also folkloric witches as well. So Vance Randolph collected a lot of really great stories about different witches. So there's famously Granny Whitaker and Graham French and Graham Wassett and all of these different sort of granny figures that in and of themselves are folkloric characters, archetypes that connect back to lots of different sort of granny figures. And so I wanted to take those characters and I wanted to merge them with my teachers. And I wanted to create this character that wasn't just a character, but a guide.
A guide,
and so,
right.
Yeah. So Granny Thornapple has really been my guide for a long time. And I'm now gifting it out as a part of these stories so that she can be a guide for other people. And so, I don't talk about this a lot in the book, actually, ironically, but, there's a real basis sort of a secret basis for the book, that, you know, the stories that are presented, the verbal charms that are presented, and this book is focused really on the charming tradition in the Ozarks. And so the stories and the verbal charms, if you catch them, you catch them. If you don't, you don't. And so that is kind of, I really wanted to make this as a teaching story. And I hope I'm successful in that. I hope that people enjoy the story that I'm presenting. And then, of course, the verbal charms. This is really kind of close to my heart and practice, because the majority of what I do is not very showy. You know, it doesn't make a very good episode of, you know, Ghost Hunters or whatever is popular right now, you know.
I'm going to challenge you on this.
Okay.
I'm going to challenge you on this, because although it's not Ghost Hunters, right? And there are other Llewellyn authors who just came out with a book about, oh, that's more like Ghost Hunters, right? What I do want to say though, and I think I hope I said this when I reached, for those listeners, I had an advanced view of the book. I was able to read it beforehand, an uncorrected copy, and I just adored it so much. And I want to challenge you on that. I think what you're tying into, the feeling I got from it, at least, was like watching practical magic, like watching The Craft, like watching a really good episode of The Good Witch, right? It has that homey quality. There's a certain scene, I was just kind of trying to quickly get to it in the manuscript you sent me, and I couldn't find it, but there's a scene where one of the characters is running up the hill to get help, just running up the hill to get help. And like that feeling of like, absolute, I need to get there, that emotional connection to that scene. Because I've had a run like that. I think most people have had that desperation of, I need help. And throughout the book, there are scenes like that. And then you lead in with the information, you lead in with the technique, you lead in with the charm. From a psychological point of view, that's incredibly effective, because people are going to associate. I think everybody knows their favorite scene from their favorite witchy movie. They can probably think and see and just be in that moment of what it was feeling like. And then that connection point of the association with the magic and that scene, I think from my point of view, amazing, right? I think that people are really going to get from that, to be honest.
And that's, I mean, that's completely intentional too.
Absolutely.
Because I mean, that's how folk stories work. I mean, they are formulated in such a way that it sticks, and and it plays on human emotions and things like that. And you know, the basis of I would say the majority of the verbal charms in the book actually come from repurposing, because Ozarkers are all about repurposing things. So, you know, we repurpose brooms and knives. Well, we also repurpose Bible verses. We repurpose nursery rhymes, which there are a ton of Mother Goose rhymes that are repurposed in this book that I collected from charmers. And so that kind of, you know, the storytelling tradition leads into the charming tradition. They, you know, most of the charmers that I met and worked with were also storytellers, and I don't think that that's a mistake. I think that's an intentional sort of working of this cunningness, or this sort of gift, is being able to not only just remember stories, but be able to actually evolve stories, you know. So I worked with one storyteller who we would travel around and meet different people that he knew, and he would tell very similar stories, but every group that he was telling the story to, the story changed depending on who was in the group. So there was one story that he was telling that was very funny, about him getting lost in the woods and sort of the adventure that he went on trying to get out and find his way back home. And we were in the company of one of his good friends who was a pretty well-known fisherman, and had a lot of sort of big fish stories. And so as a part of this retelling of this story within this group, he added a bit about how he tried to catch this giant catfish that he found in this pond, and it made that guy laugh, and he could connect to the story then. And it's the same thing with the verbal charming tradition too. Being able to, it's not about memorizing these charms. It's not about that. It's about they have a living quality. They live inside of us. And so it's about not just knowing what to charm for and how to charm, but it's about, being able to evolve from situation to situation to situation. And so a big part of this is, charms that are passed down word for word, because that's a kind of an important part of Ozark folk practice. But then also this other part of the charming tradition, which is much more free flow. It's much more about charming in the moment, which I have seen done, with miraculous results across the Ozarks. This idea of, I'm in the grocery store and something happens, and I can't remember a verbal charm, but I have my gift and I have the words that live inside of me, and it just sort of comes out. And so, yeah, there's a deep connection between the sort of storytelling, but then also folk charms, and how they live inside of us, how they evolve and grow inside of us. And I think that's one thing that I think is very different from the sort of more ritual oriented work that is presented in the first two books. And honestly, from an Ozark folk practitioner perspective, the charming tradition is not always readily available and readily presented. It's much more subtle because, it involves words, and you don't always have to vocalize words for words to be said. And so it's not always a ritual that can be observed or can be recorded. And so a lot of times it gets passed by. It got passed by the folklorists.
Absolutely.
The folklorist, Vance Randolph wasn't talking about, the verbal charm tradition very much. He mentioned it a couple times, but so it's one of these things that, it's subtle, and I think it plays much more on a sort of internal universal level than a lot of the external rituals.
Yep. I definitely think so too, and that quality right there is certainly not just connected to the Ozarks. That really goes back to like the Celtic countries, to Europe, many Native American traditions, very very similar. That quality of the voice, that quality of being in the moment, right? That enlivening is animism, right? It's an animistic approach. Yeah. And I think in truth, maybe I'm really dumping on the witchcraft community tonight. I don't know what that's all about, but I think that part is that deprogramming of that kind of Christian orthodoxy kind of view, where it has to be by rote, it has to be by this. Because what I love about your work is that you really challenge that idea that folk tradition has to be by rote, has to be by orthodoxy, especially when it comes to things like Bible verses. You make the point that, in an oral culture like the Ozarks, and this is true of all oral cultures, even in like Britain, a lot of the same, interestingly, a lot of the same Bible verses are used in the oral traditions of the Cunning as they are in the Ozarks, even though they're separated by hundreds of years and thousands of miles. But it's that oral quality too. Sometimes it's even just a matter of changing some of those words, but getting that spirit down, right?
Yeah, or one of my favorite things to look at was sort of apocryphal stories and verses, because I mean, for a very long time, Ozarkers, it was very uncommon to find people that could read and write, and that apart from, once the big cities started, coming about, schools started, being formed. But generally speaking, like a lot of this was based in strictly oral folk culture, and it's very interesting to see. I collected them from people that could read, but, quoting the Bible, but that verse is not in the Bible, that's, or stories that are told from, featuring biblical characters, but were never in the Bible. And so it's this idea of, storytelling as a way of sort of expanding the written words, not just from the Bible, but from, what we call grimoires in general
Totally.
and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was saying with the lady that had the 6th and 7th book of Moses that she bought from the pharmacy. So this idea of oral folk culture as a way of expanding upon those stories. And I think that's something that unfortunately we are losing, because we can't remember things anymore, really. And
Yes.
it probably, I'm no scientist, but I think it has a direct connection to the amount of information we process through technology, through interacting with
Oh,
technology.
absolutely.
And we just have very different brains, I think, and we have very different priorities. And so I think this can also go back to that sort of anachronistic, this idea of, oh, we should go back to oral folk culture. That was the real way to go. And it's like, okay, well, I challenge you then to remember the amount of stories that these older generations were able to remember. And it's not going to happen. It's just not going to be there.
No.
So as a part of this, my own practice, because I am one of these people that has a hard time remembering things, as a part of my own personal practice, and as a way of connecting with this practice in a modern way, in the book, I really try to emphasize this idea of going with your gut and working from this place of, the spontaneous generation of folk charms in the moment, or spontaneous prayers that come out in the moment, because that sort of transcends our need to necessarily remember a bunch of stuff. And if you are good at memorizing charms out there in the universe, then I highly recommend always memorize them. You will engage with them in a very deep way. But what I try to encourage my students now that are, just getting interested in this, as well as just people casually interested in folk magic in general, is this idea of trying to find some seed or kernel of some interior work to connect to, so that not everything is, aren't reliant upon exterior things for everything that you do. And connecting to that is going to make it a much more meaningful path, a much more meaningful work. And for me, and this was verified by several of my teachers, that's the real work. The exterior stuff is just, icing on the cake, or whatever metaphor you want to use. But that sort of interior spontaneous connection, that's what we're getting at. That's what we're trying to cultivate. And that is a real source of power too in the world. And so I think, not to knock ritual, because I wrote an entire book of ritual. I think that ritual work is very important, so long as ritual work subtly guides you towards that interior work. Because at the end of the day, I've quoted this probably a million times now, but one of my teachers, who was the one that identified the gift within me, she gave me this phrase that has just stuck with me. You should be able to do everything you need to do in a completely empty jail cell. And so that's really where magical theory sort of connects to real world living. If you don't have your candles and your incense and your chalk, what are you going to do? Are you just going to give up and not work? If you're faced with a situation where, you're in a prison cell and you have nothing else, is that the end of your magical career? Or is there something internal that we can connect to, even without the external stuff, that can further us within our practice, within our work, and actually can help us? And going back to the idea of folk magic addressing the community, how are you going to help the community when you don't have all your stuff, or you don't have your prayers or your rituals, things like that? When you're out in the community, how are you going to help the community? And sometimes that is blessing prescription medications in the spot. Or I met a lady who worked for a soup kitchen in her community, and every time she was stirring that pot, she was praying over it.
Putting things into it, yeah.
And that is like, she had nothing apart from her words and this
Totally.
medium to work through. And so I think at the heart of Granny Thornapple, that's what I'm getting at. Is this connection to that sort of interior world.
I think that's so important. Well, as you were saying that, I was reminded of an interview by Damien Eccles, who very famously was in prison for 25 years, 20 years, and was exonerated, came out. And in prison, like, he connected with all of these spiritual techniques, and he said, in prison, I didn't have, like, when I was beaten to a pulp and I didn't have access to all of these, like, counseling and this and that, I had to reach in and find those spiritual resources for myself and expand the practice to the limits of what I could explore with it, and that gave me that peace. I think that is often that can often get lost when people are overwhelmed by some of the reasons that they come to these traditions in the first place. That seeking of, and I think that most people get there eventually, and if they don't, they move on to the next thing that might give them that jolt. But I completely agree. And I think that comes across very well in these. I think that of what I've seen and noticed, really, that folk practice of using what you have, even if it's just a Bible verse, even if it's just your breath, even if it's just being in that moment, right? I think that's very powerful. And it's the simple things. I think that people get overwhelmed with the simple things, though. Do you think?
Yeah. And
yeah.
And it's not showy all the time either, which, as a very visual person, as an artistic sort of person, I like the visual stuff. I like the ritual stuff because you can see it and you can engage with all your senses. And it's maybe, not for everyone, but for, I think, the majority of people, it's more difficult to connect to the simple stuff. And so, it's this idea of the easiest work being the hardest work, because you really have to engage with it. But I think that, from an Ozark perspective, but this is, cross-cultural and folk traditions, we're left breadcrumbs. We're, through ritual and through connecting to verbal charms and prayers, and that we're left these breadcrumbs that eventually, I think, take us interior. Because, it's a natural sort of progression. If you are a person who is memorizing rituals and memorizing charms and things like that, you're probably going to encounter a situation where you have to engage magically, but you don't have the stuff to engage.
Yes.
And then you're either going to sort of break apart in that moment, or you're going to find another path. You're going to find another route. And so from an Ozark perspective, that's like the point behind all of these stories and all of this sort of interior process is this idea that when you reach that point, you'll have a breadcrumb that you remember, and it's going to take you in the right direction where you need to go. So I think that's an important part of every tradition. Is that sort of connecting inward, but it's also it's difficult because coming from kind of I grew up in a conservative church, and so for a long time I connected more to external ritual oriented work, and I didn't want to connect to spiritual stuff. And this is something that I hear a lot and have heard for a long time is folk magic isn't religious oriented or spiritual oriented. Witchcraft, there's no religion in witchcraft. You don't have to have a religion in witchcraft. You don't have to have a spiritual tradition in witchcraft. I hear it a lot. Well, when hoodoo and conjure was more sort of publicly popular, that was always the thing. You can practice hoodoo and not have any religion whatsoever. And I think that from an Ozark perspective, I think in a modern Ozark world, I don't think necessarily that any sort of religious leaning matters all that much, but there is a deep sort of wellspring of spiritual connection. Yeah, and it's, you know, defined in a variety of different ways, but I think that folk magic, as it connects to the community, is connecting to both the visible and invisible community. And so as folk magicians, you know, we may not have religious connections, but there are deep spiritual connections that we make within the practices. And those are spiritual connections that are able to help us then address the bodies and spirits together of the community. And so I don't think that that's something that can be divorced from the practice in a sort of wholly materialistic way. From an Ozark perspective, the sort of spiritual and materialistic stuff is always together. So you know,
they have to be, right? They have to be. Yeah,
they
have
exist.
to be.
They exist together, and so that's something that we've kind of lost connection to, that we're trying to get back to now. And I always tell people, you know, if you want to work traditionally, you've got to address the body, the mind, the spirit all together.
Totally. Absolutely. This is the thing I find when people ask me about ancestor work too. They either go, the pendulum swings one way entirely to the psychological and the individualistic, or it goes entirely the other way and it's all about collectivism and losing self in ancestor work. And both are really dangerous paths, right? I think a middle way is needed. But essentially relationship is spirituality. That's what, for me, that's why relationship appears in my book so often. And I think that oftentimes people are not sure how to relate. People don't know what relationship is, what relationship could be like. Even religion, you know, what is religion but relationship with a deity? That's it. It's as simple as that. And so when relating to self, when relating to other, when relating to God, with whoever you're relating to, all of the things are just there to facilitate that relationship, right? And
Absolutely,
the deeper you go, you know, and the deeper you go in that relationship, the more slang you will learn, the more body language you'll be able to learn, the more you'll be able to communicate without all the things, right? You know, but I think it takes time to kind of, it's a process to get there, you know.
And I really like that aspect of relationship, because I mean that's kind of a pitfall for a lot of new practitioners, is, you know, who have been sort of hurt in a lot of relationships, especially relationships towards religion and towards family and things like that. And this idea of developing a relationship is with the community, with your own spirituality, with teachers, whatever it is really scary. And I completely understand that. This comes up a lot when I teach about the invisible world. So when I teach about spirits and things like that, because everybody is so scared to work with ancestors and spirits, because they're so scared that, you know, they're going to get possessed, and not to say that, you know, there aren't dangers in all of this work, but I always tell people, especially around ancestors, you know, the best way to honor the ancestors is by, you know, living a good life as the sort of embodiment of the ancestors, but also, you know, you get to choose who to have a relationship with.
This is the thing.
And if your grandma was, you know, a terrible person, you don't have to invite her to come forward. You know, you get to choose how those relationships are made, but don't avoid making the relationships just because you're afraid that, you know, you're going to get hurt by a relationship, that sort of thing.
It's a thing.
You know, define your boundaries, define, you know, who you want to come forward, who you don't. And so I think, relationship is at the heart of that, relating to the community as an embodiment of both the living and the dead and all the other environmental spirits and everything. But having a relationship with that, we really can't be, even though I want to be a hermit all the time, we really can't. And from an Ozark perspective, and I think this is probably true in a lot of different traditions, a folk healer or a practitioner who is completely separate from the the community, invisible or visible, is it doesn't exist.
Well,
That
what
relation,
role?
yeah,
Sorry,
the
go on.
role and the relationship really defines the figure.
That's exactly it. And I definitely think that's cross-cultural, right? That idea of like, who do we think we are? We're folk healers, we're witches, we're however way you want to label yourself. But what does that mean? And what responsibility do you have? That's the other key piece. I don't think a lot of people, when they're first stepping into these traditions, they have a hard time with relationship, but they also have a hard time with responsibility, right? Especially those who are coming from a place of hurt and want that healing, right? Suddenly it's like, oh, I have power. I have power. There's power here. But power comes through responsibility, right? I think I want to end off today with that word relationship because it's such an important part of my own book, and it's such an important part of your books too, especially with Granny Thornapple, because what really comes through those stories is the relationships between all those characters. It feels so cozy and like I'm trying to think if it was in this one or the Ozark Folk Magic one where it's standing in the grocery store and then the trailer trash individual is like like that scene could be like Dallas, right? But it's so over the top, but it's so wonderful too because again it speaks to those relationships between those characters and we're invited into that. Love that.
Yeah, no, that was that was based on an actual experience I had with one of my teachers.
Of course, yes, that's right.
And it was amazing. It was, so we were just in the grocery store, and my teacher had, it was a small town, and so it was one of these towns where everybody sort of knew everything and was in everybody's business. And yeah, there was a lady that, and this kind of plays on that, the power of language too. In the South, it's, saying that you're going to pray for someone, I'll pray for you. It's not a nice thing.
Thanks.
It's not a nice thing to say, even though it's like, from the outside you would think, oh yeah, well, they're going to pray for me, that's a good, but that's not what people mean. It's like, bless your heart. That's not, they're not blessing your heart.
No,
that's not what they're
yes.
doing.
Yes, it's like British people saying fine thanks, yes, no.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's the power of language, and that's a big part of the charming tradition, is this idea of, we don't waste any energy that comes towards us, whether or not somebody blesses us or curses us. As a part of this charming path, you take it, you eat it, and you regurgitate it back,
Mm-hmm.
and you recycle it. And that's just a part of being in this flow with nature, and which is at the heart of the charming tradition in general. And so it's this idea that, if the busybody at the grocery store comes up and starts, essentially cursing you with satire, or with these sort of cultural phrases, that you should be able to take that and deliver it back to them on a silver platter. And in this case, my teacher won and won the interaction, and the lady went away affected by the situation. So yeah, that's a huge part of this. And I think I talk about it in the book, about the power of language. And that's at the heart of this, and it doesn't matter what language it is. Every culture has these things. Every culture has these. When the old lady, comes up and says, when are you going to get married? When are you going to have a baby? They mean something very specific by it. And as a part of the charming tradition, in its bigger, maybe more universal sense, it's being able to take that and use that energy to then reciprocate.
I love that. I love that so much. I was connecting with a friend who is of Italian background, and we were talking about Malokia, the evil eye, right? And that piece around language. Language isn't just verbal. Language is physical. It's language is everything. It's how you're communicating, right? And there can be a lot of harm done just by a different form of language. I love that so much. Brandon, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I've really kept you longer than I had anticipated, but this was really excellent. How can people find you? And I understand you also have classes on your website that you offer, archive classes. Tell us a little bit about those.
Sure. So yeah, easiest way to find me is through my website, ozarkhealing.com. And yeah, I have an archive list of classes, old virtual classes. So if people want to connect to Ozark Folk Traditions, they can look into those. I do a variety of different subjects, and so they're kind of it's a random mishmash of a lot of different things. And then I'm hoping this fall to have another virtual class series going. And yeah, I'm keeping writing, and the book is going to come out. Granny Thornapple, she's going to make an appearance early January of 2024, and
So
really
looking forward to it.
that.
I'm so looking forward to it.
You were saying earlier that you're excited about having a physical copy, and I think I am also as excited as everybody else about having a physical copy of this. This has been this has been a work I've connected to on a different level, and it's kind of become my favorite. Yeah.
Curious what else you have for us after this. I'm very curious. Very curious. Brandon,
I have a
thank you
lot
so
in the
much.
works, so
I will put all of those details down below. For those of you who are watching later tonight or tomorrow or whenever you're watching, go and subscribe to Brandon's mailing list, and something that Brandon's very, very, very proud about, right, Brandon?
Yes, yeah. And they can subscribe on the homepage, ozarkhealing.com. There's a subscription thing, so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, Brandon, our conversation is coming to an end, but the summer series is not yet over for those who are still with us, still fighting along with us. Next week, I have Christopher Hughes coming on, and then the week after, I have a good friend of mine, Gareth Blackthorn, who is an occult artist and all sorts of other things. So both of them are going to be coming on, and then we start our fall series. And if you enjoyed Brandon's conversation, a lot of our colleagues in the folklore and folkloric and traditional witchcraft community are coming and joining us. Many of them also spoke at the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival that Brandon and I both spoke at. So do go and check that out. Brandon's class and my class and a couple of my other guests are all still on there. You can access those classes as well up until December. And in the meantime, Brandon, thank you so much. You have a good rest of the night, and everybody else have a good rest of the night or day wherever you happen to be.